Hello, and everyone. Welcome to this online event entitled The Army and the Union in the Long 18th Century. My name is Eamon O'Keefe. I'm the National Army Museum Junior Research Fellow here at Queen's College in Cambridge. It's my pleasure to host this panel discussion this evening. The event is sponsored by the National Army Museum, which is located in Chelsea in London, as well as the Centre for Geopolitics here at the University of Cambridge. Both the museum and the centre run robust programs of talks and events, and I would encourage you to visit their respective websites and sign into their mailing lists to keep abreast of these. So to move on to the subject of tonight's discussion, the long 18th century was in many respects defined by war. Britain and Ireland were involved in major armed conflicts for nearly half of the years between 1688 and 1815, while a preponderance of state spending was devoted to preparing for and prosecuting hostilities. Even peacetime saw considerable military activity and smaller scale campaigns. Most of the violence and destruction associated with the wars of the long 18th century took place outside Britain and Ireland, although there were, of course, important exceptions, notably the campaigns between the supporters of James II and William of Orange in 1688 to 91, the Jacobite Rebellion of 1745 to 46, and the Irish Rebellion of 1798. Yet over the past few decades, historians have increasingly challenged the traditional assumption that 18th century wars were limited, remote affairs that impinged little on the daily existence of most people's lives in Britain and Ireland. Rather, war has increasingly been seen as a major cause of change, one which made an impact on manifold aspects of contemporary life, from religious attitudes to the arts and industrial development. The aim of this event is to bring together leading historians to reflect and debate on the impact of armed conflict and military service on politics, government, and society. Encompassing the Revolution of 1688 to the Napoleonic Wars, the discussion will consider the conduct of soldiers in different parts of Britain and Ireland, local attitudes to their presence, and consider how war and the reputation of the military might have evolved over time. The focus tonight will be on the army and the domestic repercussions for Britain and Ireland. Yet we must also, of course, remain mindful of the naval and the global dimensions of conflict in this period, not least because the wars of this era brought about both the loss of the American colonies as well as the drastic expansion of the British Empire elsewhere. Now, tonight I'm joined by three historians who have written extensively on the impact of war and society. The Professor Stephen Conway is a historian at University College in London. His books include The British Isles and the American War of Independence, War, State and Society in the mid-18th century Britain and Ireland, and most recently, the British Army 1714 to 83, an institutional history. We're having some issues connecting with Stephen tonight, but we'll work that out as we go along. We're also joined by Dr. Katrina Kennedy, who's a senior lecturer at the University of York. Her publications include Narratives of the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, Military and Civilian Experience in Britain and Ireland, as well as a co-edited book entitled Soldiering in Britain and Ireland, 1750 to 1850. Finally, we welcome Dr. Hannah Smith, an associate professor at the University of Oxford. Her books include a co-edited collection entitled Civilians and War in Europe, 1618 to 1815, as well as Armies and Political Change in Britain, 1660 to 1750, which was published last year. So this event will comprise a roundtable discussion lasting for approximately an hour, followed by a half hour in which audience members will have the chance to pose questions for our panelists. Please feel free to type your questions in the Q&A box on Zoom as the event progresses so that we can collate them and present a selection to the panelists at the end. I'd also encourage audience members to give their names and any affiliations they might wish to share along with their questions. Please also let us know whether the question is directed at all the panelists or intended for a specific person. Before we begin, I should also say a few words about the title of this event. The nomenclature, the Army and the Union, is intended to tie this discussion into the Centre for Geopolitics' upcoming initiatives exploring the past and present of the UK Union. And indeed, as I mentioned earlier, a key theme of this discussion will be to consider how war and military service shaped interactions between the different peoples living in Britain and Ireland in the long 18th century. But it's also vital to recognize that the constitutional relationship between the different kingdoms was evolving during this period, not least as a result of the demands of war and national security. While England, Scotland, and Ireland were ruled by a common sovereign, they initially had separate parliaments. The Scottish legislature was joined with the Westminster Parliament in the 1707 Acts of Union, but the Irish legislature remained a distinct entity, albeit one which was in practice generally subordinate to its British equivalent. Only in 1801, in the aftermath of the Rebellion of 1798, was the Irish Parliament incorporated into the Westminster Parliament, giving rise to the United Kingdom in the form it would take until the independence of most of Ireland in the 20th century. So as a way of opening up the discussion, I'd like to share a vignette from the memoirs of Robert Eadie, who is a native of Dunblane in Scotland. He enlisted in the Royal Manx Fencibles in the late 1790s during the war against revolutionary France. Now, Eadie described his regiment as a motley crew comprising Englishmen, Scots, and Irishmen, as well as recruits from the Isle of Man. Relations between the different national groups were fractious, to say the least, with soldiers routinely trading insults about each other's homelands. When Eadie made the mistake of treading on the heel of a Welshman on parade, he was reproached with, quote, "the most horrid curses upon me and my country." Fisticuffs promptly ensued. But according to Eadie, the colonel successfully curbed the squabbling with a vehement address to his subordinates one day after parade. Quote, "Although you are not all born in the same country," he asked, "do you not enjoy the same administration, liberty, and laws? Do you not, as companions of arms, serve under the same banner?" Such earnest appeals were accompanied by the threat that any man who might be so base as to reproach his neighbor with his country would face exemplary punishment in front of the whole corps. Now, Eadie's account is, I think, revealing. On the one hand, it testifies to the potential depth of national divisions, even at the end of this period, and the consequent challenges these could pose for military cohesion. But it also draws attention to the role of military service in potentially bringing together disparate peoples and creating a capacity for new outlooks and affinities. Now, questions of national identity have long preoccupied historians of war in the long 18th century, not least due to the influence of a 1992 book written by Linda Colley. In Britain's Forging a Nation, Colley contended that recurrent war was central to creating an overarching British national consciousness, as English, Welsh, and Scottish Protestants found common cause in struggles against mainly Catholic France and Spain. The British nation, Colley wrote, was an invention forged by war, which, quote, largely defined itself through fighting. It's a testament to the influence of Colley's work that her book has been so often debated, endorsed, and criticized in the 3 decades since its publication. So to begin this roundtable for our first question, I'd like to ask each of our panelists how well they think Colley's thesis has held up. What are the strengths and what might be the limitations for our understanding of the impact of war on society it presented in that work?
Who would you like to begin? Would you like, will I have a go? Okay. Well, I mean, as you said there, it's been a Colley's thesis, which was incredibly compellingly argued, a very clear, coherent, forceful thesis. And like any argument like that, which I suppose is made in such a kind of forceful way, it has successfully stimulated a great amount of debate. I mean, I suppose one of the things I'm interested in is the fact that Colley put a great deal of emphasis in the role of war in constructing a British national consciousness, without actually including any evidence from the armed forces or really thinking about, you know, what role did the armed forces play in that process, or the extent to which they could be understood as schools of the nation in this period. So certainly since Britons was published, there's been a lot more interest in the army and in the navy as well, and thinking about it in those terms, in terms of the construction of broader identities across the the four nations of the British Isles. So I think that's been a very important legacy of the work. It was really to re-stimulate interest in the history of the army from perhaps historians who might not have thought of military history as something that was necessarily something that they would engage with. So it's definitely made military history of more interest to social historians, cultural historians, and so on. So that is, a significant impact. Speaking as a historian of Ireland, of course, one of the criticisms that could be levelled against Colley was, of course, that she made this very persuasive argument about the role of war in the construction of British identity, but didn't include Ireland because she thought Protestantism was, one of the key binding ingredients. So, but the Irish participation in the armed forces, of course, then also offers a challenge to her thesis. If war is so essential, then why wasn't involvement in the armed forces enough to provide a kind of integrative stimulant for Irish membership of a broader Ukrainian identity?
Katrina. Thank you so much, Katrina. Hannah, would you like to add anything?
Yes, I think just thinking about the period before 1750 and thinking about how aspects of Colley's thesis perhaps works and perhaps is perhaps more complicated for that earlier period, and quite a lot of the analysis of Britons does belong to the post-1750 period. So in particular, in Britons, Colley does talk about the role, the opportunities that the union between England and Scotland provided for Scots, and this notion of being North Britons. And I think particularly in certainly looking at the pre-1750 period, one can think about how the army actually worked very well in providing opportunities for Scottish army officers, and how they gain through military commissions perhaps a greater sense of being British. This is facilitated partly because in sort of the 1720s, 1730s, Walpole's government needs the participation of the Duke of Argyll to help manage Scottish politics, and Argyll is obviously a former general, had a career in Spain during the War of Spanish Succession. So he very much considers himself as a military man, and he's seen as a sort of fount of patronage for Scottish army officers, to the extent that English army officers, indeed Welsh army officers, feel quite put out. Indeed, we've got one Welsh army officer saying, "Well, actually, if I'd been born a Scot, I'd have been promoted by now." So that aspect, I think, on how the union provides opportunities for Scots, I think, which Colley highlights, I think works nicely. I suppose there are ways in which actually, this tension between English and Scots, which continues after the Union, perhaps suggests ways in which British identities are still not quite formed, and that certainly English army officers have a sense that the British Army really is sort of part of, that the patronage should sort of be handed out to them. So yeah.
Great, thank you, Hannah. Now it seems we're still having issues, unfortunately, connecting in with Stephen and his connection. We're going to continue with the event with the panelists we have, and we'll see if Stephen can join us later. Now, just picking up on what you said earlier, Katrina, I think a very good point raised about how for the emphasis on war as this binding agent in Colley's Britons, there's some discussion of the volunteers in the Napoleonic Wars, but otherwise the armed forces, especially the regular army, doesn't really feature heavily in the analysis. And what this book has done, as you say, has brought out a significant interest in looking at what sort of identities and loyalties is the army cultivating. In some cases, which have affirmed, but also questioned quite strongly aspects of Colley's thesis when it comes to the army. So that brings us, I think, to the next question here, which is what kind of allegiances did the army tend to foster? Was this a school for the nation, the 18th century army, a place where soldiers might begin to feel more British, or is there a culture of loyalism or loyalty to the monarch as opposed to the nation, or are local and regimental or even sort of professional military identities and affinities paramount in what you see and what you've studied on the military in this period?
Yeah. Thanks, Eamon. Yeah, well, I think your lovely opening vignette, I suppose, illustrated some of the ways in which, of course, the army does, act as an integrative force insofar as it does bring people, soldiers from across the four nations into contact with each other, sometimes into conflict with each other as well. But I suppose as one of the few professions or institutions that really operates in an all British or an all UK context after 1801, certainly we could think of it acting as a school of the nation in that respect. On the other hand, certainly this is my sense from the later history of the British Army, from the 1770s onwards, the opportunity to actively propagandize its soldiers or to instill a sense of British identity isn't really taken. It doesn't seem particularly interested in fostering that broader Britannic identity. And also, I mean, and this may well be the case as Irish soldiers and Irish Catholic soldiers begin to enter the army in greater numbers, that it discourages a more kind of patriotic king and country ethos, that there's some sense in which that is diluted or attenuated so as perhaps not to disrupt the delicate mix of different nationalities, different regions within the forces. So, I mean, my sense is that, I suppose what makes in many ways, the army a very distinctive pan-British institution is its ability to handle these multiple regional and national identities, and the extent to which it allows for the expression of Highland identities, it allows for the expression of Irish regimental identities. So yes, as an institute, in contrast to, say, the French Revolutionary Army of the 1790s, which really does understand itself as an instrument that will turn it can turn its soldiers into republicans and works very hard to do that. It doesn't seem that the British Army understands itself in quite the same way or uses the instruments in its power to do that.
Thank you very much, Katrina, for that answer. I just want to check in now with Stephen. How's the connection?
The connection is now perfect. I
can
hear everybody as though they're human beings rather than Daleks.
Excellent.
And I can see everything and hear everything, but unfortunately I've missed quite a lot.
Yes,
so
well, that's okay.
Apologies for that.
We can pick up where we left off. It's great to have you back in the discussion, Stephen. So I was just posing a question. I'll pose it to you now, and then Hannah in a minute. We were discussing Linda Colley's Britons, the impact of that, and what people think about it now, 30 years on, with the new scholarship that's gone on. But more particularly now, what role does the army play in fostering identities? Is the army an engine of Britishness, or do we see it as a place where regimental identities or local or regional identities, or even professional military ones, a sense of the profession of arms maybe over national identity. What is the army? What sort of identities is the army propagating in this period, and which ones do you think are most important?
Well, Linda Colley's work, which is our starting point here, was immensely influential, and in many ways it's still stood the test of time very well. But it's fair to say, I think, historians who are interested in identity are now thinking about this in broader ways and different ways from at the time when Linda Colley wrote her seminal work. She was concerned with Britishness. I think there's a very good case for saying the army can be seen as fostering Britishness, a sense of Britishness, both amongst those who served in it, because it did bring together people from the component nations of the British Isles in a common endeavour, but also for those who saw it from afar, who witnessed its activities and saw it as somehow symbolic of the nation and the national effort, in much the same way as they saw the Royal Navy. But I think the recent trend of scholarship is to emphasize different kinds of identity, to think about some of the identities perhaps that brought soldiers into the army in the first place. And those, I suppose, are partly local identities, a kind of sense of local connection that was exploited by those who were trying to recruit soldiers, especially when regiments came to be associated with particular counties or towns. Masculine identities, we shouldn't forget the importance of gender identities. Masculine identities were appealed to attract soldiers to join the army. It was their way to be able to demonstrate their sexual potency to women. It was a way in which they would protect women, their loved ones. It emphasized their role as warriors. So all of those considerations, I think, are important. But it's once soldiers were in the army, I think the primary way in which they would feel a sense of collective belonging was towards the army as an institution. So in this sense, this is a reference to your point, Eamon, about professional identities or occupational identities. These, I think, are coming to the fore in modern scholarship quite a lot. The way in which soldiers didn't necessarily see themselves as part of a British state instrument, but they saw themselves as part of a military fraternity that meant that they had connections with other soldiers, not simply, of course, other soldiers in their own army, but soldiers in other armies, allies, auxiliaries, even enemies. They could see in certain circumstances themselves as having stronger connections with other soldiers than they had with civilians of their own nationality.
Great, thank you, Stephen, for that fascinating answer. I'd like to now turn to Hannah. Would you have anything to add? You're on mute. You're on mute, Hannah. Sorry, you unclicking the left hand. There we go. Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry about that. So just to pick up on Stephen's point about, in a sense, how soldiers connect across with other soldiers in different armies, I think a fascinating example is the Hanoverian army. And certainly there are a lot of tensions, late 1730s, early 1740s, soldiers in the British Army feel the Hanoverian army. There's a perception that in previous wars, the Hanoverian army hasn't performed very well. And this is, and this sense, this is sort of compounded by the favour that George II shows to his Hanoverian army. And this causes considerable discontent, and that those close to the king are very worried about this, and in fact don't want him to go campaigning because they feel this he will then sort of again show his favour to Hanoverian troops, and that British troops will become discontented and possibly seditious. This changes later on in the War of the Austrian Succession, when it's believed by members of the British Army that Hanoverian army has actually proved very courageous and fought well. And there's comments that from soldiers saying they're willing to share bread with Hanoverian troops. So there's a real sense there that despite certain tensions, actually there's a real bond by troops from different countries showing sort of a high level of professional conduct. I suppose just another point, if I may, in Britain's Colley often talks about Protestantism being this sort of glue that helps bind groups together. And one of the critiques of Britain's has been that actually the book doesn't perhaps pay enough attention to different religious Protestant denominations and how that complicates British Protestant identities. And one can see that in the British Army too, while at some level there's a real strong sense of anti-Catholicism and a disrespect for continental Catholics, which is a problem when British troops are in Catholic territories of allies. The emergence of Methodism proves quite complicated for British Army leaders because Methodists are very zealous. They conduct services outside of the sort of the more formal ecclesiastical structures of the army, and are potentially quite seditious too, in the sense that they have a sort of that they are prepared to sort of tell their religious message to their military seniors. And there's some worry that in some sense that the Methodists are rather like Oliver Cromwell's army of and there perhaps this might lead to some sort of Republican tendencies. So yes, the complications with Protestantism, I think, actually sort of shows up in the British Army as well.
Great, thank you, Hannah, for that response. I'd like to now move to another question, although picking up on some of the points that we've just heard about politics. For instance, Hannah was mentioning the dissension between the British and Hanoverian side of things, the fact that the Georges were also the monarchs of Hanover, and there was a dissension. There was a sense that sometimes in Britain, a popular sense that foreign policy and war was being directed by Hanoverian interests first rather than British ones. And so this becoming a bit of a political football in the 18th century. I mean, how far does war and the army as an institution, how far does it feature in political debates in perhaps your respective areas of expertise? Who would like to start with this?
I could say a little bit about my period. In some senses, the army features as a player off the main stage, in the sense that debates about the militia, attempts to create a new militia at the start of the 7 Years' War in the 1750s, is explicitly an alternative to the army. It's an alternative to a professional standing army, and it is meant to be a citizenry, an armed citizenry, which is portrayed as less threatening or completely unthreatening to the liberties of the subject, in the way that a professional army clearly is not. A professional army is seen as not simply an instrument for the exercise of external power, but also potentially a threat to individual liberties of the subject. Because if a malignly intentioned monarch or government decides to use the army, it can suppress its own people in the way that in popular British political thinking, Louis XIV's French army had done. So there was great suspicion still in the middle of the 18th century of regular standing armies, and the militia was promoted by its advocates as an alternative. It wasn't necessary to have a standing army. The navy would defend our coasts, and the militia would defend the homeland if it were invaded. That kind of debate is in a sense replaced by the 1780s by a new debate about how you create an armed citizenry as an alternative to a standing army, because the militia itself becomes discredited. It becomes very quickly apparent to its advocates that it no longer is actually an alternative to the army. It's an adjunct to the army. It's trained and equipped and dressed much like the regular army. During the 7 Years' War and then during the War of American Independence, it's embodied or called out for active service alongside regular troops. So it starts to appear as though it's so closely associated with the regular standing army. It's no longer the alternative its advocates had hoped for. So then we start seeing in the closing stages of the American War of Independence, the emergence of volunteer units. Those are very famous in the Irish context, but they emerge in the British context too, in a much smaller scale. But they again are touted by their advocates as an alternative to regular mercenary armies. So this debate about the legitimacy of the standing army is a running theme through the period on which I specialize. There are other very specific debates that crop up. There's a fascinating debate about the creation of the Royal American Regiment at the start of the 7 Years' War. There's a lot of opposition to the creation of that regiment. It requires a special act of Parliament to create it, because the Act of Settlement of 1701 forbade foreigners from holding offices under the Crown. So in 1756, a special act is required to effectively put to one side the requirements of the Act of Settlement, because the new Royal American Regiment is to be opened, its officer ranks are to be opened up to foreign Protestants, particularly German, Swiss and Dutch Protestants. Now this actually causes quite an outcry. The parliamentary opposition claimed that it's wrong to put foreigners in positions of military authority, and the American colonies lobby quite strongly for the exclusion of foreign Protestants on the grounds that this will reduce the number of opportunities for their own people to get commissions in this new regiment. So that's a rather interesting way in which national politics and imperial politics too coincide on an issue to do with a seemingly simple question of raising an additional regiment for the British Army. And then at the end of my period, we also see a lot of discussion, debate, conflict in Britain over the way in which the British Army is augmented during the War of American Independence. Opposition politicians who are critical of the war in America, don't believe it's just or wise, object to local subscriptions to increase bounty money for specific regiments or to encourage the raising of new regiments. They say this is a violation of Parliament's rights to control the army, because this is raising money to be used to recruit soldiers for the army without parliamentary oversight. Now, those objections had never been raised in previous wars when similar methods were used, and it's very clearly a barometer of how politically sensitive the issue is in the context of the American War, where political opinion in Britain is really split right down the middle over the justice and propriety of the war in America.
Great, thank you so much, Stephen. So we'll come to Hannah in a minute, because she's written a whole book about this, politics But I'd like to ask Katrina now for a second about the later 18th century. I'm interested in maybe picking up what Stephen said about the role of the volunteers in Ireland during the American War, the political impact of that. I wonder if you could give us a bit of a sense of that, and perhaps also the role of mobilization as a political issue, the issue of national security around the Union. How is war shaping the debates we see in the later 18th, early 19th century? You're on mute again, sorry.
Yes, as Stephen said, obviously the raising of the volunteers during the American War in Ireland has quite significant political implications there, because it becomes a movement, part of the movement, Protestant patriot movement, pushing for greater economic and legislative autonomy for Ireland, and using the opportunity of the American War to really press for those advantages. And that does mean that in the 1790s, when volunteers regiments are being raised in Britain, that they're explicitly forbidden in Ireland. They're suppressed when there's an attempt to revive them as in a more radical format. And the sort of 1790s Irish equivalent will be the Irish Yeomanry, which is first raised in 1796 and becomes seen as a kind of the armed wing of the Protestant state, almost the armed wing of the Orange Order. So, you know, these auxiliary bodies are becoming very politicized. Or at least the perception of them is that they are no longer neutral bodies. But then thinking about the militia, which is raised in Ireland in 1793 to again provide for home defence as troops are being withdrawn for the war against France. That really exacerbates political tensions in Ireland. There's extensive rioting in response to the introduction of the Militia Act, which falls most heavily on ordinary Irish Catholics. And that's often, there's very high levels of violence. 200 people or so are killed in response to the riots, and that's often seen as a kind of the first chapter of the 1798 rebellion in one sense, or as we ratcheting up levels of violence in Ireland. But, of course, in Britain as well, in the during the Revolutionary Napoleonic Wars, a lot of the issues that Stephen was talking about, the continuing suspicion of standing armies of professional soldiers, that continues on in radical discourse, people like Mary Wollstonecraft, who are very hostile to the professional soldier, the mercenary soldier. And I suppose also the army itself becomes debates around corruption, and political corruption is, I suppose, the language that is perhaps most often used to critique the army. And of course, most famously, there's in 1806, the fallout from the Mary Ann Clark affair, where the Duke of York, the commander of the British Army's mistress, is revealed as having kind of used her influence to secure military patronage. So a lot, the radical discourse around questions of corruption often focus in on the army and its role in what they see as a kind of corrupt political system.
Great, thank you, Katrina. Now, Hannah, I was wondering if you could give us a summary of your recent work on the Army's role in political debates in the first half of the 18th and the later 17th centuries.
Okay, so I suppose obviously there's quite a considerable hostility to standing armies. That is particularly the case in the late 1690s when army is being disbanded and William III is campaigning to retain a large number of troops. Some of the arguments are that actually paid soldiers don't make very good soldiers. They're mercenaries. They can become a tool for a tyrant. And there's some interest in militias. And certainly that sort of language carries on into the early to mid 18th century. I think it's also interesting to look at how the army is defended by pro-army writers that try and deconstruct some of these assumptions, emphasizing both the sort of political virtue of the officer corps, but also actually of soldiers, and emphasizing that soldiers are there, laying down their lives for liberty, for Protestantism, and therefore they're not just, shouldn't just be seen as mere mercenaries. And one argument that comes across in these debates is the linking of these political arguments with its interpretations of important political events. So there is, so the writers, for example, cite the Glorious Revolution and the Protestant succession. So that's how, and so using this, saying that actually army officers, soldiers have supported the Glorious Revolution, they've supported the Hanoverian succession, and again this shows that actually they're committed to up to parliamentary monarchy.
Great, thank you, Hannah. Now I have a few questions now for the individual panelists to draw out some of the themes that have been particularly prominent in their work, and to raise some wider questions. Stephen, I'd first like to ask you, how does war shape the development of the 18th century British state? There's been work on John Brewer and a considerable amount further talking about the role of war in changing and influencing the state. Could you maybe give the listeners, the audience, a bit of a sense of where the scholarship is at on that question?
Yeah, thank you, Eamon. The state is perhaps one of the most slippery terms in the English language. And one aspect of the 18th century British state we've already touched upon, the idea of a national community. So I'll leave that one aside and focus on perhaps what is generally understood by the state as government and its apparatus. And here I think John Brewer, as you said, set the scene with the idea of the fiscal military state, that the state made war, and it's certainly very obvious that in this period throughout the 18th century, right up in fact until the early 20th century, the state's primary responsibility was the waging of war, preparing for the waging of war, and finding ways to pay afterwards for the waging of war. The vast bulk of public expenditure was on war, preparation for war, or servicing the debt that had been incurred in fighting war. We're in an era when very little else occupies the minds of ministers in terms of spending priorities. So this is long before we have anything like a centrally funded health service or education or social services. So the big ticket item is war, and armies clearly are part of that. We should acknowledge that navies are also part of it, and one of the developments since Brewer is perhaps an emphasis on the idea that it's perhaps better to talk about the naval fiscal military state, in the sense that spending on the navy usually outstrips spending on the army, and largely because of obviously the capital cost of ships and the infrastructure required to support the navy. But the army played a part in this, and it's certainly collectively the army and navy grew in size enormously in successive wars. They seem to have grown in size. The revenue services grew in size in order to support the raising of money to pay for these augmented militaries. And of course, we have to remember that it's not, Britain's military capacity is not simply a question of the number of soldiers and sailors it raises from its own population. Money is required to pay for other people fighting Britain's wars as well. So these European auxiliaries, their costs are covered by the British taxpayer. significant contributions are made to the costs of mobilizing colonial manpower too, from the British taxpayers. So the raising of money, the revenue services, this is one of the principal areas of growth. But there are a whole range of other ways in which the state apparatus expands and becomes more powerful, more sophisticated. The Treasury acquires greater and greater knowledge and expertise in contracting for services. And again, recent scholarship emphasizes rather less the physical military state, but now perhaps the contractor state, the idea that the British state raises large amounts of money, but spends a lot of it on getting other people to do things for it. So provide it with goods and services. In that sense, one of the themes that also appears in the recent literature is the idea of a partnership between the state and private and local interests to mobilize resources, manpower and money, to wage war. So we're getting a much more nuanced sense of the growth of the state and state power, and a greater recognition, I think, that even in a period where state power seems to be growing and expanding, there's still an enormous amount of reliance on private and local interests working in partnership with government agencies.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for that fluent response. I'd now like to ask Katrina, since much of your work has considered Ireland. I mean, the challenge with much of the research and literature on 18th century war and society is it very much becomes a British story. How do we understand Ireland, and maybe especially the role of Irish Catholics and how they respond to war? Do they enlist? Do they rebel? There are various narratives that can be told, and how do we reconcile them into one that best captures the 18th century reality?
Yes, well, and it's a really good question, because of course British-Irish relations really from the mid 18th century onwards are very much being shaped by the manpower demands of the British state, and certainly attitudes towards Irish Catholics more broadly are also being driven by this. And just for you know, to provide some context, this isn't, you know, in the context of the penal laws against Catholics in both Britain and Ireland, which forbid them from owning land, practicing their religion, or playing any role within the political nation. And you know, towards from the American War onwards, the British state, which wants to recruit Irish Catholics into the army, was looking for new sources of manpower to wage these increasingly complex and expensive wars, is pushing through or pressing for the relaxation of the penal laws against Catholics in Ireland, sometimes, you know, encountering hostility from the Irish Protestant state. But this is a kind of way, you know, it becomes a way of restraining Protestant demands for greater autonomy, you know, by using the threat that Catholics will be further emancipated. But from the American War onwards, Catholics are being recruited into the British Army, and by the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, around 140,000 at least are recruited into the regular British Army, and more then into the Navy as well. And I think it is, you know, I mean, it does, as I suggested at the beginning, you know, pose some challenging questions for the Colley model, because in some ways they are being, you know, they do serve well within the army, is the sense that they, I mean, there have been some suggestions that they deserted in higher numbers, but that isn't really borne out by the evidence. And the army itself also becomes quite a flexible institution in terms of how it treats and relates to Irish Catholics. So Michael Snape, who's written extensively on religion in the British Army, suggests that really it's one of the most tolerant institutions in British or Irish society at this time, insofar as it does allow Catholics in Ireland from 1793 to attend Mass, and then that's extended to the whole army from the 19th century. So there is a suggestion that in some ways Irish Catholics at least might find the British Army to be a more congenial space to inhabit than the quite challenging sectarian environment that they would have found back home in Ireland. So that kind of flexibility does seem to be able to, elicit some sense of loyalty from the Irish Catholics who serve in the army. And also, I suppose that there is a suggestion, which I think there's some truth to this, that it's actually within the British Army that Irish Catholics are encountering a form of Irish patriotism that they wouldn't, or regimental Irishness that wouldn't necessarily have been available to them back home. We have to remember that in the 18th century, Irish patriotism is largely in the form that we might recognize it, is very much a kind of as a public phenomenon. It's a Protestant phenomenon. So those Irish soldiers who are going into the Irish regiments, like the Connacht Rangers and so on, that might be the first time they're encountering that kind of regimental Irishness, as well as possibly the first time that they're also encountering regular Catholic services as well, given that in Ireland itself, the Catholic Church is quite weak, so they might not have had regular access to services. So yeah, the army has a kind of very interesting role to play, I think, in thinking about the evolution of Catholic Irish identities in this period, which may well be happening within that UK context.
Thank you, Katrina. I have one more question for Hannah, which is if you could tell us a bit about the relationship, please, between the monarchs and their armies. How does that change over time and with different sovereigns in the first half of the 18th century?
I mean, it is quite complex and it changes. I suppose one constant is military patronage, and this provides the monarch with a sort of a key hold over officers. Certainly, how that patronage is distributed depends particularly on the gender of the monarch. So where you've got William III, George I, George II, all soldier kings, they often have quite close relations with their officer corps, and they have the professional sort of expertise to assess promotion. I think all three monarchs are very keen to promote officers who are good at their job, and try and resist the pleas by ministers to appoint politically suitable candidates, or the candidates of politicians that ministers wish to please. And there is certainly an element of politics in patronage. But it is one to some extent that I think certainly George II really tries to resist. I think what's interesting is what happens when there is a female, there's a Queen Regnant, Queen Anne on the throne, and obviously her relationship with her officer corps is going to be more distant. But even so, she still has quite a clear sense of the fact that she is, she's sort of, the commander of the army in essence, and so she will, although she accepts recommendations from her husband, Prince George of Denmark, from the Duke of Marlborough, her captain general, one does get a sense that in the end, Anne wishes to have an army that is her army, and when she feels that the Duke of Marlborough is becoming all too powerful, she is prepared to listen to others, and make particular changes. One could argue whether or not she actually does have that much power over her army, but it's certainly something she aspires to. So I think if you start, you've got a female ruler, it's an interesting insight into sort of those relationships between monarchs and their army officers.
Great, thank you, Hannah. Now we'll soon be opening it up for questions from the floor. But I think one question I'd like to get to before that is to ask a little bit about the shape of the military presence, the duties that soldiers would be performing, and attitudes towards soldiers, and how they differed across Britain and Ireland in your period. So what are soldiers doing, and how do people perceive them, and are they perceived differently, as I expect they would be in different places, different parts of these islands?
Do you want me to start, Eamon, if no one else wants to come in? I think we should always remember that even in the 18th century, when there seemed to be an awful lot of wars, there's an awful lot of peace as well. And the army is deployed in peacetime primarily in the home islands, is primarily employed in England, I think, to support the civil power. In the Highlands of Scotland and parts of Ireland, perhaps as an occupying force to keep down potential political insurrection. But the army in the English context is undoubtedly available to assist in putting down disorder and putting down riots, and riot duty is something that the army is involved in quite a lot. It also helps in anti-smuggling duties. So the army has a kind of function that is domestic and is not about its fighting strength in the sense that we think of the army serving abroad. I mean, Britain does not, apart from the Jacobite rebellions of 1715 and 1745, experience invasion, and that invasion needs to be qualified. It's a kind of domestic insurrection more than an invasion. So civilians encountering the army, thinking about the army, don't see it perhaps as a force defending them so much as perhaps a burden. When troops are quartered, because of the political hostility in England, at least, to barracks, that's not the case in Ireland and Scotland, where barracks are extensively employed to house troops. But in England, there are very few barracks, and those that there are in old, not purpose-built barracks, they're in old fortifications. But most troops moving around the country have to be accommodated in public houses. And they're called public houses because the Mutiny Act defined an appropriate place to quarter troops as public houses as opposed to private houses. And it was a no-no to put troops in private homes because that smacked of French-style despotism. But putting them in public houses was thought to be the appropriate way of accommodating them when they were moving around. But this was regularly a source of great complaint from innkeepers because the amount of money they were allowed was nowhere near as much as they'd get for non-military customers. And there were all sorts of other problems that might arise having soldiers in close proximity to drink. So there were views, I think, of the army informed by what we were talking about earlier on as a potential threat to liberty, and wariness about the army at best. I think that starts to change, perhaps in the 7 Years' War, when the army starts to be associated with success, and the army starts to produce some of its own military heroes, which could match naval heroes. So Wolfe's death at Quebec in 1759 makes him into a national hero. And with him is elevated the reputation of the army. So the army starts to be seen in somewhat more favourable terms by at least some parts of the population. We should remember, of course, that negative views of the army need to be set alongside more positive ones. Hannah was talking earlier on about pro-army politicians and pamphleteers, but there's also, of course, those people who made money out of the army, and that's an important thing to remember. There are lots of contractors, subcontractors who make money out of supplying the army, and they would have had, I think, an altogether more favourable view of the military being in their neighbourhood.
Great, thank you, Stephen. I'd like to ask the same question to the other panelists, but first to emphasize, please do keep questions coming in, members of the audience. We'd love to see a few more in the chat to augment the ones we have already. Katrina or Hannah, do you have any thoughts on what is the army doing in your period, and what do people think of it? Is this more coercive? Is it playing coercive roles? Is it defending the nation from invasion, or and how do we see those roles shaping what people think of the army?
Shall I come in here? I mean, the period I look at, say early to mid 18th century, that troops do, it's not just a policing role, but it's essentially attempts to stamp out Jacobite activity and promote the new Protestant Hanoverian monarchs. And indeed, quartering is very carefully politically calculated so that towns that have a reputation for Jacobitism, disaffection to the Hanoverian monarchy, are often in the line for troops, and those towns that are known to be very loyal to Hanoverian succession tend not to get troops at all, partly because their MPs make a big fuss and say, you know, we're all very loyal Whigs here, and therefore don't send these troops, which does suggest how burdensome troops are viewed. Having said that, I think one can also emphasize that actually very positive civil-military relations existed in towns, and so they tend not to be recorded. It's usually the riots, the fights that turn up in the records, but you know, there is sometimes there seems to be quite good relationships, particularly where a troop is well disciplined, the officers get on well with the local elites, and they're sort of seen as a benefit, probably not by innkeepers, but there's the potential there for good relations too.
I mean, thinking of Ireland, just picking up on Hannah's point there about the quartering in the early 18th century, and of course, although there are barracks in Ireland, which are in many ways symbolic of what is seen as the military's role as a kind of a garrison force, an occupying force in the, you know, in the 1790s, when the army is being used to suppress radicalism in the United Irishmen, quartering is reintroduced in Ulster as part of the dragooning of Ulster, and implemented with great brutality. So obviously really kind of adding a great deal of conflict to civilian and military relations. But I think, yeah, the point about the changing perception of the military and the more positive perception of the military that I think both Hannah and Stephen have mentioned, that really does, you know, come through in a lot of accounts of the revolutionary Napoleonic period. Of course, Eamon, you'll know a lot about this, about, you know, the role of regimental bands in bringing colour and music to the various towns in which they're stationed, the role of the military as patrons of local theatre, you know, so this is you know, that sense that particularly with the militia, which is stationed in different regions of Britain, that they are bringing kind of culture and money, you know, to these various areas. So I think that, you know, there are a lot of very positive, benign accounts of civilian military interactions, particularly, you know, from 1800 onwards, as the army itself is becoming more successful, as I suppose a rhetoric of wartime patriotism has become more widely accepted. And we only need to think of the excitement that the arrival of the militia regiment brings in Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice to kind of see some of that, you know, positive, perhaps newly positive attitude towards the glamour and spectacle of military culture that, you know, has been, I think, probably a theme that's been developing from the 7 Years' War onwards through the American War, when there's the wonderful kind of volunteer encampments and so on as a site of this, you know, military spectacle. Yeah, so I mean, there's both, on the one hand, certainly looking at the Irish experience or their role as a kind of in suppressing protest. There are, you know, there's a lingering negative image, but there's also a sense in which, you know, they're welcomed as bringing kind of vibrancy or colour to local life.
Great, thank you so much, Katrina. Now, I'd like to get to some of the questions we've been receiving from the audience. We've got one from Saul Yardley, who mentions that popular books such as Smollett's Roderick Random or Voltaire's Candides, these were rapidly translated into English, they presented a disparaging view of soldiers. And his question is whether you think publications like this had an impact on how the army is viewed. And I suppose we could expand that to think about what's the role of media, engravings, the theater, even, for changing attitudes or shaping attitudes to soldiers in this period.
Well, I'll maybe have a go at answer, or a first attempt to that. But I think that's a really interesting point. And I think you know, looking at Smollett's work, and that's sometimes been characterized as a literature of the military grotesque, in so far as it, you know, doesn't depict a very romanticized vision of the military, and is quite frank about the horrors of war. And you know, thinking into the later period, certainly from the Revolution, Napoleonic Wars onward, where you have people like Walter Scott and others who are increasingly writing, you know, if not necessarily contemporary military stories with contemporary settings, but heroic, historic romances that really tap into and glorify the culture of war, alongside, absolutely, as you mentioned, Eamon, theatrical representations. And I think the theatre, you know, is a major driver of support for the military. And of course, it's interesting because, again, this is not a state-driven form of patriotism. It is, you know, that this is partly, I suppose, one of Colley's arguments was that actually, you know, it was the theatre was presenting this these very positive, heroic images of the military on stage because it was commercially successful. So that's, you know, that again, thinking about the way in which there are commercial drivers for a more positive, more kind of heroicized image of the military that emerge over the course of the 18th century.
Thank you. Do either of our other panelists have any thoughts?
I would just like to add that it could be argued that that process of it starts earlier, and in particular, one could look at the plays by Susanna Sodlivre in Queen Anne's reign and into George I's reign that depict heroic army officers who are committed to Protestantism, to parliamentary monarchy. And she's a highly successful playwright, and these are popular plays that get quite a lot of viewings in commercial theatre, and indeed she publishes them. I suppose another way in which ideas about military heroism are conveyed, and particularly what might be called sort of the interwar period between the end of the War of the Spanish Succession and the start of the War of the Austrian Succession, is the growth of histories about the War of the Spanish Succession, commemorations of the Duke of Marlborough, notably at Blenheim, but also funerary monuments to other army officers, which again always stress, their patriotic service, their commitment to Protestantism, to liberty. So you can go to the theatre, you can go into churches, and you can read, see these ideas are there and present in those spaces, and you could argue they're growing over the course of the 18th century.
Yeah, I think one of the difficult things for us to perhaps reconcile is the view of people like Joseph Massey, who in the middle of the 18th century is drawing up his tables of wealth and how it's distributed, and right down at the bottom is the common soldier. And that, in a sense, does exemplify one view of the common soldier, very much the poor relation, as Wellington would later put it, the scum of the earth. This kind of very much the detritus of society. We need to fit that alongside this increasing image of the army as somehow glamorous. As Hannah said, there are military heroes long before Wolfe, and the most obvious one is Marlborough himself. And reputationally, army officers are often seen as patriots and defenders of the faith and their country. And as Catriona said, there are greater opportunities for the army to entertain and enliven life for many people. These great military camps that are set up in the 7 Years' War, in the American War, and then again in the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, to concentrate troops and militia, to train them and prepare them to repel an invasion. Those become the focus of enormous public interest. Lots of people visit them. And again, we have to remember how little there is in the way of entertainment in people's lives in this period. It's very much focused on local communities. So the arrival of a great military host in the area would have attracted enormous attention. Now, some of the estimates of the size of the crowds going to these military encampments are almost certainly fanciful, but it looks as though thousands and thousands of people come. Special coach services are laid on. It becomes big business to bring people to these military encampments. So that the idea of the spectacle, the glamour of the army, we need to put alongside this image of the common soldier as poor, as really the very scrapings of society.
Great, thank you, Stephen. We've got several other questions which I'd like to follow up on. One I think is interesting from Nicola Martin, perhaps especially for Stephen and Katrina, given your work on this. Nicola writes, I'm interested in the discussion of the sense of fraternity among soldiers, even those within opposing armies. Is this feeling of commonality and shared experience something that holds up even during active periods of conflict, especially in those conflicts where there are accusations of outrages and violations of the laws of war on both sides?
Hello, Nicola. I'm sure you're the same Nicola. I can't see you, but I'm sure it's the same Nicola I know. Thank you for the question. I think it's perfectly possible for this sense of a military fraternity to survive wartime. In fact, wartime provides perhaps its greatest opportunity to show itself, because soldiers experience the same stresses and strains. Their lives are in danger, they're often short of food, they share the same privations. regardless of what army they're in. There's lots of evidence we have of officers of different armies feeling a sense of professional pride and working to a kind of common set of values and norms, understanding the etiquette of how to fight, and that being something that cuts across all European armies. Obviously, the transfer of personnel from army to army enhances this too. Many professional soldiers are like professional footballers. They don't have particularly loyalty to a state or a club. In the case of footballers, they'll move around where the opportunities are greatest. And we do need to think of soldiering as a career with opportunities for promotion and advancement and making money. And soldiers, officers, I think very much thought of it in those terms. So moving from one service to another facilitates this kind of sense of a military fraternity, but it's based, I think, on essentially on a common set of values and probably a common set of social norms and backgrounds that were more or less to be found across Europe. The common soldier, you might think, is rather excluded from this. Surely they would be different. Well, we do have evidence that soldiers, Hannah cited a good example earlier on, Hanoverian and British soldiers sharing bread with each other, a very symbolic gesture as well as a practical thing. Sharing bread is really a sign of inclusion. And we've got lots of other evidence of that. Even the journal of a British corporal serving in Germany in the 7 Years' War demonstrates that he exchanged food with French sentries. They talked to each other across a river that formed the boundary between the front lines, and they interacted in ways that led this corporal to say, well, the enemy are rather good people. So I don't think the fact they're fighting each other and simultaneously accusing the other of violations of the laws of war stops them from seeing themselves as part of the same military fraternity. In a sense, accusing your opponents of breaching the rules suggests you all feel you were bound by the same rules.
Just to add to what Stephen said there, absolutely, and I think particularly a sense of a shared military community between the British and the French, actually, that survives despite the fact that they're at war for much of the 18th century. But the fact, obviously, that British elites have such strong ties to France, would have gone on the Grand Tour there. Many of them, Wellington, for example, I think is trains at one of the French military colleges. So in some ways, the British officer corps does look to France for some of its military values, because there isn't such a well-established military sense of professional identity, perhaps, within Britain at this time. And that survives, into the revolutionary Napoleonic period, despite the fact that a lot of the rules, the conventions that would have previously governed military conduct have been being ripped up by the French Republican Army. So it is very interesting, the fact that, that often it seems that the British Army feels itself to have more in common with French soldiers than it does with their allies in Spain or Egypt or wherever it is, actually, because they're drawing on those pre-existing cultural connections and a sense that they belong to a shared military community, whereas some of the irregular warfare that's being practiced, for instance, in Spain, very much goes against that sense of community.
Great, thank you. We've got questions flooding in. We won't unfortunately have time for all of them, given that we want to finish promptly at past. But I'll try to select a few that I think add especially to the discussion that we've been having so far. Robin Thomas asks, to what extent do you think that the state, in scare quotes there, I think, central authorities, aim deliberately to improve military civil relationships or relations by integrating soldiers into communities. He's thinking about quartering arrangements or allowing soldiers to accept employment outside the regiment. How successful do you think central efforts to mitigate the problems associated with soldiers resident in the community, how successful might these efforts have been?
I think a primary concern for the Army's officers, and I guess for those who ran the Army, politicians and senior military figures, was desertion. Integration with the local community could work either way. So allowing soldiers to work in the civilian economy when they're not actually required for military duties, which is a common practice, is seen, I think, by officers as a way of preventing desertion, because soldiers are poorly paid and they often need to boost their pay by working in the civilian economy. It can also be the case, of course, though, that integration and working particularly in the civilian economy can encourage desertion, because soldiers are in a sense decoupled from the military environment and have a taste of a civilian environment they might find more attractive. They start seeing themselves as having a capacity to earn money outside the army and therefore maybe want to leave it. I think from the point of view of military-civilian relations, this issue of working in the civilian economy, soldiers working in the civilian economy, can also be very positive in the sense that employers like the fact they could get cheap labor, but also very much a cause of tension, because obviously other members of the labor force resented it enormously. And so we get a lot of hostility, rioting directed towards soldiers working in the civilian economy. We know that the famous or infamous Boston Massacre of 1770, its roots lie in this practice of soldiers working in the local economy that then creates real sense of competition for jobs, which fuels local hostility to the military.
Do either of our other panelists want to chime in on this?
I mean, yes, I suppose another way to think about it is in terms of soldier marriages, soldiers marrying women within local communities. And this is also a potential source of conflict and tension, particularly for commanding officers who don't necessarily want indeed, don't encourage soldiers to marry. This potentially becomes a problem when wives and families accompany soldiers around the country, putting pressure on local communities, and particularly when soldiers and their regiments are sent overseas to fight, and these families are left to sort of fend for themselves and have to travel back to the husband's parish to receive poor relief, causing all sorts of complications financially to parishes along the way. So this potentially is seen as a problem both for local office holders, but also, of course, for commanding officers.
Would you like to add to that, Katrina, or should we move on? Okay, we've got one more question here that I'd like to raise. Hugo Clark says that Stephen refers to soldiers as being from the detritus of society, the lower dregs of society. Is there any evidence that attitudes to common soldiers and the profession of soldiering varied between the nations during the 18th century? I suppose especially we could think about maybe Scottish Highlanders. Do people have different motives? Do men have different motives for joining the army, and different attitudes depending on where they're from and what society, what areas they are born into?
I guess I should qualify what I said earlier on. I was really talking about the image of the soldier more than perhaps necessarily the reality. We know that a lot of common soldiers came from unskilled labouring backgrounds, but there were significant numbers, particularly in wartime when the army is looking for recruits wherever it could find it. There were quite a lot of men who came from artisanal or skilled backgrounds as well. So there's more of a social mix perhaps than the stereotype implied, but there were plenty of men who were in pretty desperate state when they joined the army. And it's no coincidence that recruiting for the army was at its strongest in the winter. When you look at recruiting returns, a lot of them are drawn up in the months of November, December, January, and February. And this, of course, is the period when there is the least amount of work available in the agricultural economy in particular, but in the urban economy too. Lots of men were looking for work and opportunities. It's also worth saying that recruiting was heavily concentrated in the towns and cities. It was young men perhaps migrating internally from the surrounding countryside into the towns and cities who were ripe for recruitment. They were looking for work and opportunities, and if they didn't find them in urban centres like London or Bristol or Leeds or Manchester or Birmingham or Glasgow or Edinburgh or Dublin, then they would probably fall for the blandishments of a recruiting officer. So my sense is young men joined the army principally because they didn't have much alternative, and they really were looking to find a way of making at least a little money.
Great, thank you, Stephen. Hannah or Katrina, would you like to contribute?
Well, just, I mean, I think, as Stephen said, I think that a lot of the reasons and the background for the ordinary soldier will be similar across the four nations. In Ireland in the 1790s, there is evidence that recruits are coming from those areas that have been most affected by sectarian conflict. So there are perhaps other drivers, as well as the typical ones, as you know, to do with poor harvests or economic depressions, and also, of course, there's quite a significant, or not insignificant proportion of Irish Catholics who are pressed into the army, those who have been charged with being rebels of some kind, so that's another kind of route in for them.
Okay, thank you. Would you like to add anything, Hannah, or we can wrap up? You would? Oh, no. Okay, well, thank you very much. Well, thanks so much, Katrina, Hannah, and Stephen, for your time and the insights that you've shared with us this evening. We've ranged very broadly, thinking about, say, the shaping of national identity, attitudes towards soldiers and the army as an institution, and the impact of war on society, politics, and government. I'd urge you to look at further events and sign up to the mailing list of the Center for Geopolitics, as well as the National Army Museum, to see the range of events that they have going into the new year. But for now, thanks everyone for attending. Thank you to our panelists for contributing. Have a good night.